packed the socialist meetings with mad enthusiasm, it was impervious to the wiles of the old party politicians. The old party orators were usually greeted with empty halls, though occasionally they encountered full halls, where they were so roughly handled that more than once it was necessary to call out the police reserves. History was making fast. The air was vibrant with things happening and impending. The country was on the verge of hard times, caused by a series of prosperous years wherein the difficulty of disposing abroad of the unconsumed surplus had become increasingly difficult. Industries were working short time. Many great factories were standing idle against the time when the surplus should be gone, and wages were being cut right and left. Note: under the capitalist regime, these periods of hard times were as inevitable as they were absurd. Prosperity always brought calamity. This, of course, was due to the excess of unconsumed profits that was piled up. Also, the great machinists' strike had been broken. 200,000 machinists, along with their 500,000 allies in the metalworking trades, had been defeated in as bloody a strike as had ever marked the United States. Pitched battles had been fought with the small armies of army strikebreakers put in the field by the employers' associations. The Black Hundreds, appearing in scores of wide-scattered places, had destroyed property, and in consequence 100,000 regular soldiers of the United States had been called out to put a frightful end to the whole affair. A number of the labor leaders had been executed. Many others had been sentenced to prison, while thousands of the rank and file of the strikers had been herded into bullpens and abominably treated by the soldiers. Note: strikebreakers. These were in purpose and practice and everything except name the private soldiers of the capitalists. They were thoroughly organized and well armed, and they were held in readiness to be hurled in special trains to any part of the country where labor went on strike or was locked out by the employers. Only those curious times could have given rise to the amazing spectacle of one, Farley, a notorious commander of strikebreakers who, in 1906, swept across the United States in special trains from New York to San Francisco with an army of 2,500 men, fully armed and equipped, to break a strike of the San Francisco streetcar men. Such an act was in direct violation of the laws of the land. The fact that this act and thousands of similar acts went unpunished goes to show how completely the judiciary was the creature of the plutocracy. Note: bullpen. In a miners' strike in Idaho, in the latter part of the 19th century, it happened that many of the strikers were confined in a bullpen by the troops. The practice and the name continued in the 20th century. The years of prosperity were now to be paid for. All markets were glutted. All markets were falling. And amidst the general crumble of prices, the price of labor crumbled fastest of all. The land was convulsed with industrial dissensions. Labor was striking here, there, and everywhere. And where it was not striking, it was being turned out by the capitalists. The papers were filled with tales of violence and blood, and through it all the Black Hundreds played their part. Riot, arson, and wanton destruction of property was their function, and well they performed it. The whole regular army was in the field, called there by the actions of the Black Hundreds. Note: the name only, and not the idea, was imported from Russia. The Black Hundreds were a development out of the secret agents of the capitalists, and their use arose in the labor struggles of the 19th century. There is no discussion of this. No less an authority of the times than Carroll D. Wright, United States Commissioner of Labor, is responsible for the statement. From his book entitled The Battles of Labor is quoted the declaration that, in some of the great historic strikes, the employers themselves have instigated acts of violence, that manufacturers have deliberately provoked strikes in order to get rid of surplus stock, and that freight cars have been burned by employers' agents during railroad strikes in order to increase disorder. It was out of these secret agents of the employers that the Black Hundreds arose, and it was they, in turn, that later became that terrible weapon of the oligarchy, the agent provocateur. Never had labor received such an all-round beating. The great captains of industry, the oligarchs, had for the first time thrown their full weight into the breach the struggling employers' associations had made. These associations were practically middle-class affairs, and now, compelled by hard times and crashing markets, and aided by the great captains of industry, they gave organized labor an awful and decisive defeat. It was an all-powerful alliance, but it was an alliance of the lion and the lamb, as the middle class was soon to learn. Labor was bloody and sullen, but crushed. Yet its defeat did not put an end to the hard times. The banks, themselves constituting one of the most important forces of the oligarchy, continued to call in credits. The Wall Street group turned the stock market into a maelstrom where the values of all the land crumbled away almost to nothingness. And out of all the wrack and ruin rose the form of the nascent oligarchy, imperturbable, indifferent, and sure. Its serenity and certitude was terrifying. Not only did it use its own vast power, but it used all the power of the United States Treasury to carry out its plans. Note: Wall Street, so named from a street in ancient New York, where was situated the stock exchange, and where the irrational organization of society permitted underhanded manipulation of all the industries of the country. The captains of industry had turned upon the middle class. The employers' associations that had helped the captains of industry to tear and rend labor were now torn and rent by their quondam allies. Amidst the crashing of the middlemen, the small businessmen and manufacturers, the trusts stood firm. Nay, the trusts did more than stand firm. They were active. They sowed wind and ever more wind. For they alone knew how to reap the whirlwind and make a profit out of it. And such profits, colossal profits, strong enough themselves to weather the storm that was largely their own brewing, they turned loose and plundered the wrecks that floated about them. Values were pitifully and inconceivably shrunken, and the trusts added hugely to their holdings, even extending their enterprises into many new fields, and always at the expense of the middle class. Thus the summer of 1912 witnessed the virtual death thrust to the middle class. Even Ernest was astounded at the quickness with which it had been done. He shook his head ominously and looked forward without hope to the fall elections. "It's no use," he said. "We are beaten. The Iron Heel is here. I had hoped for a peaceable victory at the ballot box. I was wrong. Wickson was right. We shall be robbed of our few remaining liberties. The Iron Heel will walk upon our faces. Nothing remains but a bloody revolution of the working class. Of course we will win, but I shudder to think of it." And from then on, Ernest pinned his faith in revolution. In this he was in advance of his party. His fellow socialists could not agree with him. They still insisted that victory could be gained through the elections. It was not that they were stunned. They were too cool-headed and courageous for that. They were merely incredulous. That was all. Ernest could not get them seriously to fear the coming of the oligarchy. They were stirred by him, but they were too sure of their own strength. There was no room in their theoretical social evolution for an oligarchy. Therefore the oligarchy could not be. "We'll send you to Congress, and it will be all right," they told him at one of our secret meetings. "And when they take me out of Congress," Ernest replied coldly, "and put me against the wall and blow my brains out, what then?" "Then we'll rise in our might," a dozen voices answered at once. "Then you'll welter in your gore," was his retort. "I've heard that song sung by the middle class, and where is it now in its might?" End of chapter 10. Recording by Matt Saw, Montreal, mattsaw.org.